Welcome everyone to this webinar on the future of authoritarianism. I'm Staffan Lindberg, Director of the V-Dem Institute and Professor of Political Science here at University of Gothenburg. It's my pleasure to be sitting in and chairing and moderating this webinar for Serafin Merz, who unfortunately was prevented from joining us here today. The topic, the future of authoritarianism, I think is especially important today as the world is in what at least some of us call the third wave of autocratization. And by some accounts, we have lost 36 democracies since the mid-1990s. 2.6 billion people live in countries undergoing autocratization. And this year, 2020, the world was also hit by a pandemic that autocrats have been using to further undermine democratic rights and freedoms. So the future of authoritarianism is really topical. And to help us give some perspectives on this and provide their insights, we have two distinguished professors with us here today. Luca Wei is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto, and his research focus on democratization and authoritarianism both in the former Soviet Union and across the developing world. Alex Dukalski is associate professor in the School of Politics and International Relations at University College Dublin, has done research on authoritarian states, Asian politics, and international human rights. I'm very pleased to have both of you good friends and colleagues here with us today. And we will proceed as follows with two short presentations by Luca and Alex first, and then we'll have a roundtable discussion for a while, and there will be a little bit of time at the end for questions and answers from the floor. You can then use Slido for the questions and answers. You post your comments on the Slido. Go to slido.do with the hashtag V-Dem_aut as the password. This is also, and you can also see this in the chat. And then we'll pick some questions from there. So without further ado, I will hand over to our first comment by Luca Wei.
Great. Thank you. So let me just, where is it? Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Stefan. It's a pleasure. I feel like we've known each other for a very long time, and we were just talking about, we watched you evolve from an optimist to a pessimist. So this is a bit more of an optimistic take on things. And I want to talk about sort of the kind of international era we're in, which we hasn't really been given a name, but it might be called the post-Cold War era. It's sort of, and as many of you know, the end of the Cold War led to a dramatic increase in democracies. The international, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the richest and most powerful countries in the world were overwhelmingly democratic. There was no longer foreign support for autocracy, and both the United States and the European Union provided extremely active and often very effective support for democracy abroad. As a result, you saw a nearly doubling of the number of democracies between 1985 and the early 2000s. But even more significantly, you saw a dramatic decrease in the number of closed autocracies, or places in which there are simply elections don't play any role in the regime. And in fact, as my work has focused on, in some ways, you saw the rise of a hybrid regime, or what we call competitive authoritarianism, which are cases in which that combine real democratic competition, electoral competition. At the same time, you have significant democratic abuse. These were numerous cases in the early 1990s, about 35 that we identify and wrote a book about in 2010 with my co-author Stephen Levitsky. And these, in a number of cases, you had countries with extremely weak democratic prerequisites, extreme underdevelopment, ethnic cleavages, existing in an international system that simply made it very hard to be fully authoritarian. So the resulted was, as we argue, in a kind of competitive authoritarianism. Examples include Albania, Zambia, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Ukraine. These are all places in which elections were important, but in which, in determining who has power, but nonetheless you have significant abuses. At the same time, our book argues that countries, even countries with weak democratic prerequisites that have strong ties or what we call linkage to the West, democratize. Places like the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Romania, Serbia. Now in these cases, close ties to the West meant that businesses and other social actors had a strong stake in keeping the country democratic in order to keep up investment flows and the like. And as a result, you had democratization in a number of sort of unlikely places, in sort of hard countries, so to speak. Now, in many ways, since that book was published in 2010, and as we sort of anticipate in the last, or basically our last paragraph, there's been a real change in sort of the end of the post-Cold War era. We no longer have a clear liberal hegemony. China has become, since the 1990s, a global power. It's the largest share of exports in the world. And you also have an increasingly aggressive Russian and Chinese foreign policy, invasion of Ukraine by Russia, very sort of proactive pro-Chinese foreign policy by China. At the same time, in the West, you had a real demoralization. I think, for me, it really began, I think, with the Iraq War, but also with the invasion of Kosovo in 1999. I remember I went to Moscow right after the invasion, which was quite successful in terms of democratizing Serbia. But there was a real backlash and resentment by my Russian friends. And this, I think, really began the sort of period of backlash by places like Russia and the like. But also, the West sort of, was in real crisis and trouble. You had, the negative outfall from the Iraq War, financial crisis, European debt crisis, Brexit, and the like. So no longer was the West sort of this shining example of, good governance, wealth, and democracy. And furthermore, because of the Iraq War and Kosovo, democracy promotion was discredited to a large, and still is to a large extent. At the same time, and most sort of troublingly, there's really a sort of a near end to Western support for democracy. As is well known, Trump embraces autocrats. So autocrats are not punished nearly as much or discouraged by the United States as they used to be. And the EU has slowed enlargement. There's been, as we'll talk about in a second, a quite passive reaction to Hungarian backsliding, even though Hungary is a member of the EU. So the question, and you also had sort of an end of linkage as we understand it. So again, in our book, we argue that tight ties to the West basically more or less guarantee democratization, even hard places. But that no longer applies, right? So for example, in Honduras, when Juan Hernandez flouted a re-election ban, carried out a very dirty election in 2018, the US basically was didn't really do much. As a result, the business community realized that it was okay to support him. And so this was very different from the Dominican Republic, for example, in 1994, in response to election fraud, when the business community did not want to support the autocrat and encouraged democratization, largely in response to anticipated Western reaction against autocratic moves. This is no longer the case. So, this is a very different international environment. And again, you have failures within the EU of, Hungary and to a lesser extent, Poland. So the question is, we have a very different international environment, but so what is the fate of democracy in the what I'm calling the post-Cold War era? If someone can come up with a better name, please say it. I think it doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. Now, I would, as we anticipated in the last page of our, in our conclusion of our book, that sort of with the rise of China, with the sort of demoralization of the West, there are sort of now sort of far fewer external costs to democracy. And so the question arises, should we see, I expected to see many of these hybrid cases just simply become full authoritarian cases. Basically with minimal external cost of autocracy, why should autocrats now put up with competitive elections? Why not just, go full autocracy? That's a real question, right? Because it's not obvious that there are sort of serious external costs, and you also have external support for potential support for autocrats in China and Russia. Now there has been, and this is the stuff that I want to sort of, definitely sort of praise V-Dem. I mean, they've really shown this. There's been a real crisis in the big democracies, and undoubtedly we're in a sort of a period of democratic crisis in many important countries that were long considered consolidated. I mean, obviously the United States, India, Brazil. You had a populist wave in Europe with the rise of Le Pen and the Alternative for Germany, the kind of fascist party in Germany. And you've also had genuine, real democratic backsliding, by which I mean countries that were long considered consolidated democracies going back and actually becoming not democracies. And that's in places like India, United States, and Brazil, we sort of it's so far at least it's been a crisis of democracy, but still it's sort of in the democratic camp. That is clearly no longer the case in Hungary and hasn't been the case in Venezuela for over a decade. You've also had a phenomenon where sort of initially after the Cold War, you had diffusion from the West to the East. In other words, sort of democratization spreading East. With the rise of Orban, you've had a remarkable phenomenon of reverse diffusion, where sort of Orban's very clever and efforts to sort of basically create authoritarianism without serious violations of civil liberties has been, he's been an inspiration for people like Trump, Stephen Bannon, the Austrian Freedom Party. Many sort of see him as sort of something to mimic. So in some ways you have a reverse diffusion from east to west, so broadly speaking. The idea of the deep state, which is really important in the United States, has been under Trump as a sort of excuse for decimating the state as a neutral arbiter, which is very important for democracy. Arguably, that really came from Orban. He used that in the early 2010s to sort of decimate the independent bureaucracy, the autonomous bureaucracy in Hungary. So that's one side. So I definitely agree with Stefan. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to be worried about democracy, especially in countries where we used to take it for granted. But I also think there's another story that is also going on at the same time that we need to recognize, that this is not a purely negative, phenomenon. I mean, what's going on, and that this is not uniform. There are basically, I see it sort of two tales. One of crisis that has been talked about by virtually everyone. I mean, and most cogently by V-Dem, but there's also a story of genuine democratic resilience, right? In the face of this awful international environment. First, you still have 3 times fewer closed autocracies than you did in 1985. There's not been a really substantial increase in the number of full-scale autocracies. You have about, while I expected a large number of competitive authoritarian regimes to just simply transition into full authoritarianism, you still have about the same number now, 33, as you did when we wrote this book. Furthermore, despite this populist wave, you had the survival of democracy in Western Europe. I mean, I think in response to Stefan, I mean, this is one case actually. I think the impact of COVID may be very different in different countries. I think at least in Western Europe, COVID has actually given people a new appreciation of sort of technocratic governments, because I think so. In that sense, I think my impression, I could be wrong, is that in Western European countries, it's sort of discredited the populace because frankly, you want someone in charge who knows what they're doing. Furthermore, you have a quite large number of surprising successes. These are both countries that have recently transitioned back to democracy or to democracy. You know, Bolivia, Morales resigned. You've had recently a quite democratic election. The Gambia, which is like, who would have thought, you know, you had this remarkable transition in 2016, 2017, Armenia. But you also have cases that have just like the old standards that we sort of take for granted that are still democratic. Stefan's Ghana still looks pretty democratic to me. You know, who would have thought Ghana, right? So, you know, don't take Ghana for granted, Stefan. No joke. Mongolia. Stephen Fish wrote about Mongolia in 1998, still chugging away, still democratic, still surprising. The DR, Indonesia, Guyana, Peru, Sri Lanka is also a remarkable case of democratic improvement. So you have it's not just one or two, you have a large number of persistent, democracies in the face of sort of these sort of very sort of, anti-democratic wins. I mean, and if you look at the sort of the V-Dem numbers, this is, obviously does not look like a major downturn, right? This is pretty much stable. With a little slight downturn. I know that sort of, if you sort of do it by population, it looks worse, but still the point is that these are a lot of countries, very real countries that have remained democratic. So this is representing something real where we are not back in the 1980s by any stretch of the imagination, and it's certainly not the 1970s. And that basically needs to be explained. Finally, I think I just want to say a quick note about Hungary. It's true that Hungary is no longer a democracy. Nonetheless, it's interesting that there are really, so far at least, limits on a Hungarian autocracy. Opposition is not arrested. Newspapers aren't just simply shut down. We have to appreciate this stuff because it could go away, man. So don't take it for granted, right? It still looks like there are sort of real limits on what Orban can do, right? Maybe those will go away, but so far, the sort of overt civil liberties violations, you just do not see very much. And creating a Hungarian autocracy required an enormous amount of skill and subtlety by Orban, which is partly why he's been sort of a source of inspiration in other sort of full-scale democracies. It's hard to sort of transition a consolidated democracy into an autocracy, and it requires skill. Okay, so next I want to talk about what explains this resilience, right? That I think is real and is supported by the data. So I think there's sort of two main factors. The first is that there's a kind of residual democratic hegemony. You no longer have sort of, the single United States with all out there actively supporting democracy, but still, most rich countries in the world are still democratic. Furthermore, the US dominates militarily. The US currency, the United States is still a democracy, even more so. We have more hope since the November election. The currency still dominates. So you still have, the West is still, quite powerful and dominant. Furthermore, there are still, in contrast to the 70s especially, there are no real legitimate alternatives to democracy. In the 70s, communism was considered a real alternative to democracy. So that, a real popular alternative. In the 30s, it was fascism, right? That's not the case anymore. Right, you don't have those kind of, people still, democracy is still the norm. Furthermore, China and Russia don't care about, they're not trying to export authoritarianism in the way that communist regimes in the 1980s were trying to export communism. And furthermore, democracy, as V-Dem's report has shown, is still quite popular. Right, from below, you've had, as V-Dem's report shows, you had a massive wave of democratic protests in 2019 and also in 2020 in places like Belarus, Algeria and Sudan and other places. And finally, I just want to mention that, I think you still have the impact of the communications revolution. Obviously, of communications technology, obviously we know that autocrats use this for their own ends, but it's still a powerful support for democracy. It's still really hard to hide abuses in the way you could hide them in the 1930s. Stalin was able to hide sort of, killing, tens of millions of people That's simply no longer the case. And I think that sort of makes it harder on autocrats. Finally, I think what explains it is something I've written about, is the fact that some of these autocrats simply do not have the organizational capacity to create closed authoritarianism. Parties are weak and have defections. The state is underfunded and therefore is unable to crack down on even small protests. This picture is from Kyrgyzstan. It doesn't look like the police are doing particularly well here, but you got to feel a little bit sorry for them. The protesters with they're weak enough that a guy with a wooden bat is able to sort of beat back the police, right? And so, for example, one example of this is recently in Ukraine in late 2018, the president Poroshenko declared martial law. There was a fear that he would sort of use martial law to sort of end democracy. The oligarchs that surrounded him, who are not particularly democratic, immediately defected and said, screw you, we're not going to support it. He's ended up having to allow elections to go forward. And you had the emergence in 2019 of a total outsider, Zelensky, getting elected. And so that's an example of sort of a case of weakness. Georgia, I think the Gambia, arguably, I don't know as much about this case, but if you look at the collapse of the Jume government, that also, is arguably a function of party weakness. In other words, a lot of these autocrats are just simply quite weak and not strong enough to impose a full authoritarian rule. Okay, so in conclusion,
yes.
right? This is it. The post-Cold War era, basically, there are two outcomes: democratic regression, but also meaningful democratic persistence that needs to be explained despite a far less liberal international environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucan, for that fascinating overview. And stop sharing there, and then I'll ask Alex to come in and share your screen and give us your take on the future of authoritarianism. And unmute, please.
Sure. So thanks very much to you, Stefan, and to Serafina and to V-Dem for arranging this. It's really humbling to be here with so many attendees, and of course to be on a panel with Lucan, whose work I've been inspired by and reading since graduate school. It's very thrilling to be here, so thank you. The plan is, I'm going to say a few words about my new book, Making the World Safe for Dictatorship, which is coming out in the spring with Oxford University Press. And as discussed with Stefan and Serafina, I'll walk through the main points of the argument and then have a few kind of speculative comments about the future of this phenomenon so that we can kick off discussion and transition to the roundtable. So I want to start with a well-known public relations plan from a firm called Race Point Global that was doing work for the Rwandan government a number of years ago. And it caught my eye because it not only detailed plans to make Rwanda and its president, Paul Kagame, look good, look attractive and appealing for foreign audiences, but it also outlined plans to discredit opponents, to undermine human rights organizations, and detailed plans to cultivate key opinion leaders, key elites, to tell Rwanda's story well. It also noted that the kinds of tactics that were useful in DC and London and Brussels were not useful in Beijing, where cultivating a positive public image wasn't really necessary given the media environment in China. And I start with this because it's a nice example of what I'm calling authoritarian image management. Authoritarian image management I define as comprising efforts by the state or its proxies to enhance or protect the legitimacy of the state's political system among audiences outside its borders. So this includes the classic strategies of kind of external propaganda and soft power, but also the extraterritorial censorship and repression that helps sustain those concepts by shaping the international information environment. So it's sort of like soft power on decidedly hard or deceptive foundations. So the book addresses three research questions. One is what motivates authoritarian states to manage their image abroad? Like, why do they care what other people think? Second is, how do they do so? How do they manage their image abroad? What do they do concretely? And third is, what are the causal chains linking their actions to their outcomes? In other words, what do architects of authoritarian image management think they're accomplishing? Okay. I won't belabor the point because you didn't come here presumably for a literature review, but basically I try to put several strands of literature into conversation with one another to overcome what I see as sometimes the weakness of talking about these various concepts in isolation from one another. So I build on and combine and try to synthesize all the literatures you see here in various ways. So what motivates authoritarian states to try to manage their image abroad? Here I draw on work by John Owen on his work about forcibly imposing ideological systems on other states. I think it provides some insights into why authoritarian states would be motivated to manage their image abroad in the first place. And there are kind of two baskets of reasons, I think. One is it revolves around internal regime security. So in other words, it helps to make their own grip on power domestically more secure. This comes by either enhancing domestic legitimacy by reference to international developments, or to discredit opponents who might be harassing the government from abroad. And the second basket of reasons is external regime security. So here the idea is to shape the environment, the information environment, to be more enabling to authoritarian norms and practices. It's influencing or trying to tilt the playing field. So what exactly do authoritarian states do to achieve these aims? So here I try in the book to systematize this and think about the causal chains that would link different kinds of government actions to purported outcomes. And I do that by disaggregating two dimensions of this phenomenon. One is the form that it takes. So you can think about this in terms of a promotional form. So this is states promoting content that's favorable to the state. So this is things like advertorial inserts in newspapers or TV stations that promote the government's perspective on issues. But you can also think about it as an obstructive form. So in other words, the idea here is to aim to eradicate or censor or distract from or silence criticisms of the authoritarian state in international discourse. You can then divide or disaggregate by audience and think about diffuse audiences, so just general publics, or key individuals or small groups who then might convey the state's message or refrain from criticizing the state. So combine these four yield causal chains to help us explain a range of authoritarian image management tactics, I argue, from externally facing propaganda to repressing exiled dissidents. So basically, I spent a lot of time trying to bring these concepts and mechanisms to the empirical record to see whether they exist at all in the first place, the extent to which they travel, and so on. Bring lots of different kinds of evidence and data, some cross-national databases, some field work in various places, some video analysis, some online tracking of friendship groups, and so forth. I'm happy to talk about any, all, or none of that if you want. What I want to do briefly is just highlight a couple data points from chapter 4, which is sort of a bird's eye view chapter that presents some descriptive data on both sides of authoritarian image management, the promotional side and the obstructive side. So I'll just share a little bit of information with you on that. So to get a sense of the promotional tactics, I draw on data from the Foreign Agents Registration Act of the US Department of Justice. So the FARA requires certain agents of foreign principals, in other words, foreign clients, who are engaged in political activities to make periodic public disclosure of their relationship with the foreign principal. So basically, when PR firms and lobbying firms and image crafting firms do work with foreign clients, they have to report it. Okay? And FARA keeps a public database that's kind of organized in various ways on these documents. Okay? So what I did is I gathered data from active foreign principals as of December 31st, 2019. And to get a snapshot view, I examined all the filings and all registrations by foreign authoritarian entities that stipulated that activity was undertaken in 2018 or 2019. So it's really just kind of a snapshot from the last couple of years, right? It doesn't include independent companies from authoritarian states or individuals in opposition to authoritarian states or strictly kind of tourism related advertisements or anything like that. I'm trying to get at the documents that actually bear on the image of the state. Okay, so this is kind of the promotional, diffuse, and promotional specific authoritarian image management that I referred to in the 2x2. So this procedure yielded 113 filings from 33 states that were active in 2018 and 2019. The total annual value of these contracts is between about $153 million and $172 million. It's worth noting these are usually just fees. So it usually doesn't include expenses, actually. So these are really just the fees that these PR companies and lobbying companies are taking in from government-linked foreign entities. The Gulf states are the most active, but China and Russia are also spending large sums, particularly as the DOJ made their media arms register as foreign agents. Okay, some filings are vague and just kind of have really vague kind of terminology, but others are extremely detailed and include things like tracking opponents online, convincing particular groups in the United States, for example, to view the state positively. For example, students at historically Black colleges and universities, local leaders in Mountain West states. Sometimes it gets quite granular in terms of the target audience. Some stipulate explicitly that to ensure journalists publish on-message stories about the state. So there's this whole kind of world of trying to influence the way we perceive authoritarian states for a variety of reasons. I would note, I think this is a very conservative approach to trying to get a sense of this issue. This is only self-reported, it's only legal, it's only overt. So I think it's really the tip of the iceberg, the tip of what is undoubtedly a much larger iceberg. So that's kind of just a snapshot of kind of the promotional side of things. Let me tell you a little bit about the obstructive side. So to understand the obstructive side, I built something called the Authoritarian Actions Abroad database. And basically this data set tracks how authoritarian states try to target their own dissidents or critics abroad. Those of you familiar with the Central Asian Political Exiles database will see some of that in this. That database was very much an inspiration to build on and extend and modify. They really pioneered thinking in this area. The idea here is that authoritarian states target their own exiled citizens, right? Their own citizens abroad. So this is the obstructive specific side of the equation. So for the database, the universe of cases is all authoritarian states between 1991 and 2019. And the actions range from threatening the dissident's family at home, threatening the dissident themselves, arresting them, detaining them, all the way up to assassinating them. The targets are journalists, activists, former opposition members, former government officials, and a residual category of just citizens that I'll say more about in a moment. It's event-based, so multiple events can happen to one citizen. And the sources are media, it's all public. The sources are media and NGO reports. We report detailed, search procedures in the code book, but basically we search for everything in English first, and then did follow-up searches for more cases and verification in French, Korean, Chinese, Russian, Turkish, and Arabic. Again, this should be viewed, as a very conservative approach to the issue because this is only publicly available information, but authoritarian states obviously have incentives to hide when they repress or attempt to repress dissidents abroad. Okay? Basically, using this procedure, we discovered nearly 1,200, so 1,177 cases involving 35 countries, with over 2,500 individuals directly targeted. Some events targeted groups of people rather than individuals. Again, this is a conservative estimate, but I think one that is valuable for giving us kind of a sense of this phenomenon. Again, a sort of tip of the iceberg kind of analysis. And again, this will all be freely available online once the book is published. Let me just show you a couple slides that slice the data in various ways, very kind of, very descriptive and overview. You can look at by source country. So the top 10 source countries for these kinds of actions, you see a diversity in terms of regime type, geography, economic structure, and so on. You see it's also quite top heavy. So the top 5 account for about 60% of cases, I think, and the top 10 account for almost 80%. I think it also highlights the importance of transnational campaigns of repression. So Uzbekistan, many of those cases come from after the 2005 Andijan massacre, Turkey after the 2016 coup attempt, and China, many of those cases come from its intensification of its international efforts to repress Uyghurs. You can slice this by target. So citizens are the most common category, just a kind of a general residual category. Most of these are Uyghurs or North Koreans. So usually these are people who've left the state for non-political reasons, but by virtue of their identity and their status as being abroad are viewed by their states as threats to the state's image. So they're targeted at a very high rate. But activists and journalists together account for nearly half of these cases. And I think this lends credence to the idea that authoritarian states target those who might undermine their narrative or their image by spreading bad news or criticisms. In other words, it's not just direct political threats or oppositional threats that are targeted by states abroad. So I'm happy to talk about any of the other material in the book, but since this is a discussion about the future of authoritarianism, I'll make 2 speculative comments, and then we can kick off kind of discussion and go from there. The first comment is the literature, and Lucan alluded to this in his presentation, I think is absolutely right, that there's no centralized authoritarian group of states trying to make everyone else live under their authoritarian model. I just don't think there's evidence for that today. But there is a group of states, and there are groups, sub-state groups and political parties, but most notably, I think China and Russia, that wish to undermine the liberal democratic model and defend their own. They wish to discredit the liberal democratic model. So their efforts have spillover effects in terms of how people view authoritarian models, how they think they work, and will help shape the future of how authoritarianism is viewed. Finally, my last point is that the rise and intentions of China and the response of democracies, I think, is the most important factor that will shape the future of authoritarianism in our lifetimes. It's clear China doesn't wish to impose its model on other states. I think, again, Lucan is right in that assessment, but it clearly wishes to make the world more accommodating to authoritarian norms and models. We see this in the United Nations, regional organizations, its own external propaganda, and so forth. So how far this gets, and really what the response of democracies is, I think is the most important future shaper of what I call authoritarian image management, but also I think of authoritarian rule more generally. So I'll stop there and hand it back to Stefan.
Thank you so much, both of you, and thank you, Alex, here. So let me pose this to both of you, and maybe ask Lucan to respond first. So Alex talked about the authoritarian states and rulers now both selling and silencing, which sort of tallies with what you talked about in the new era, where there's no liberal hegemony anymore. Russia and China, you both point out more aggressive foreign policy, and what you talked about, Lucan, as the demoralization of the West as a result of a number of things. And while you're right, Lucan, that there's surprising democratic resilience, I would agree with that. What is the specter of this selling and silencing? And is it only China and Russia? I mean, we know about them, but there are other big countries that are not necessarily promoting democracy. I'm thinking of Philippines or with Duterte. I'm thinking about Saudi Arabia and their promotion of Salafism since the mid-1980s. We see the effects now in Malaysia and Indonesia and so on. Is this diffusion, you talked about it as reverse diffusion from the sort of urbanism spreading, but isn't it really also originating in very many different places in the world, different agendas, but they are all, or many that are anti-democratic, if I put it that way. Put on your mic. I'll ask you to unmute.
Yeah. Sorry. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, so a couple comments. Yes, I mean, thanks, Alex, for pointing that out. You're absolutely right. That certainly with Russia, there's been a clear effort, since basically the mid 2010s to interfere in Western elections. I mean, that's quite active. Actually, I wrote a paper on that. I mean, that's quite new. I mean, in the 1990s, they were sort of strictly focused on the former Soviet Union, and suddenly they got this idea, I'm not sure where it came from, to interfere in Western elections, and actually, obviously most spectacularly in the 2016 American election. And I think that's clearly sort of anti-democratic in the sense that it's about, they kind of favor, anti-democratic outsiders. But I have a couple comments on that. One, it's not at all clear that they were effective. I mean, I wrote a paper. I don't think that they tipped 2016, and there's just very little evidence that, I mean, they tried, and they definitely punched above their weight and had much more of an impact than you would expect, given Russia is such a relatively small power. But there's really no evidence that it actually changed the result or got Trump elected. And they promoted fake news, but there were plenty, believe me, I come from the United States, there are plenty of domestic sources of fake news. You didn't need Russia in the equation. My second point is that I think on balance, these countries are much more concerned about promoting pro-Russian or pro-Chinese foreign policies, and much less on the domestic politics of the countries they're targeting. And I'm assuming, it's partly, I'm going to throw the question to you, Alex, is, I'm assuming that the vast majority of this is, has to do with sort of economic, concerns and contracts and sort of, and the like. And so, and rather than sort of obviously sort of affecting domestic politics of those countries. I mean, basically, my sense of Russia is that, Putin might in his dream prefer it, everybody were an autocrat, but he's happy to work with a pro-Russian government, democratic government or a pro-Russian autocratic government. He doesn't really care all that much. In response to you, Stefan, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think I was more thinking of sort of, efforts to undermine democracies in democracies. I mean, there's obviously enormous amounts of diffusion among sort of developing countries, but many of those targets of diffusion aren't, or sort of interference aren't democratic to begin with. So it's not clear sort of what impact they have necessarily on democracy. But you could be right. I mean, I could have, it may be that ultimately, China, for example, in Africa, there's been a lot of speculation, could have a sort of, dampen democratic democracy there. That's a really good point.
Alex? Also unmute, please.
Yeah, no, so I mean, I think just in answer to Lucan's point there, no, I don't think I agree with you. I think it's not really about promoting authoritarianism in the target country. I think it's much more a matter of kind of having latitude to achieve foreign policy aims, or to have the principles on which kind of standards are judged tilt more towards the authoritarian side of things, right? So I think this is why you see China in particular working really hard at the UN, in the various UN human rights bodies, to change the way we talk about human rights, because I think that then changes, it changes the standards on which we're going to in the future judge what is appropriate, what are appropriate political arrangements. But no, I agree with you that it's not about trying to make other states kind of follow that model in any direct way.
All right. And also encourage everybody who's listening to use Slido. You can post your questions there. And you can also vote questions up or down. It's a little bit democratic. Not vote down, but vote up.
Yeah, but only up.
Yeah. And well, so piggybacking on one of those questions that we have on Slido. So what are your thoughts? I mean, you're one of the two of the best scholars we have, I think, on authoritarianism, and speaking about the future of authoritarianism. I guess we share a normative concern here about we would not like to see authoritarianism spread further. What in your view, what are some of the possible institutions or actions or things that can deter a further deterioration in the world today? Lucan, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think definitely not having an autocrat in the White House is a big. It's, you know, sometimes the answers are just obvious, but they're true, right? And I think, you know, I mean, what's interesting to me is the fact that, I mean, I think it's remarkable the fact that there was so little regression, given the fact that the major power in the world was actively favoring autocrats. I mean, to me, that, you know, these democracies didn't just survive, they survived in some ways a major stress test, right? So it even speaks to the kind of my notion of not just of survival, but of resilience. But who knows? I mean, if, you know, if Trump had been reelected, you know, that, you know, how, you know, who knows how long they would have survived. I mean, I think that, you know, that's the main thing is sort of, you know, the fact that if you have the major countries, if you have, like, obviously if the United States went autocratic or another major European power went autocratic, I think that would ultimately have major reverberations sort of globally. Yeah, no, I think that's the main thing. I actually sort of see, I mean, the sources of resilience as perhaps more structural. I mean, I think the communications revolution is hard to imagine going back to a world where you could kill 30 million people and no one would hear about it. That's, you know, impossible to imagine. That will never change. And also, I'm not sure that, you know, maybe there's an ideology out there that will sort of trump democracy, so to speak. But so far, I don't really see the popularity of democracy as changing all that much. And so the combination of sort of a very sort of you know, communications revolution and popularity of elections and democracy, I think is going to sort of provide, and to me, that provides a kind of more sort of stable structural source that will really prevent regression in the long term.
It's good to have some positive energy there, Lucan. What do you think, Alex?
Let me bring the negative energy back in. No, I think those are good points. I would say two things. I mean, one is that as we deal, you know, as democratic societies deal with the rise of authoritarian societies and kind of the autocratization of powerful states, I think it's important for democracies not to adopt the tools of authoritarianism to fight authoritarianism. So, you know, this is something I had to wrestle with a lot in the book. You know, like the most natural reaction is, okay, well, you know, China's trying to make itself look good by CGTN, so block it. But I don't think that's the right approach, right? I think, you know, then you're kind of falling into the trap of adopting authoritarian methods to fight authoritarian methods. And I don't think that's a very good way to go. So a recommitment to democratic norms and principles. And I think that dovetails with what Lucan said about the recent election in the United States very well. The second thing I would say is, you know, looking forward. So the question was about kind of what, if we're looking forward, what's on the horizon. I mean, I think the rise of China is on the horizon, right? So again, China is not trying to make a world of dictatorships, but it's trying to make its own world safe for dictatorships. And so the question becomes whether that entails facilitating authoritarian norms elsewhere or bolstering authoritarian states in the future. I think, again, right now, yeah, they don't care so much about regime type, but I could imagine a world in which they wish to have more latitude to do as they wish domestically. I'm a little bit less optimistic about kind of technological, you know, the technological support for democracy. I wouldn't say, you know, okay, you can't kill 30 million people and get away with it and not have anybody know. But I mean, if you look at the technological aspects of what's going on in Xinjiang right now, you know, you can do a lot actually in the current environment if you're willing to censor internet access and lock off you know, geographical areas. You can still commit you know, what many are calling cultural genocide and get away with it.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I mean, we have my university with Ron Diebert, wonderful colleague, and he and I have this discussion all the time. And he obviously, you know, focuses on what you point to. You know, there's tremendous sort of autocratic capabilities that come from these new technologies. And, you know, and this sort of obviously this early period of sort of pure optimism was unwarranted. But the question is on balance, right? You know, it's always, you know, when the newspaper was invented, I'm sure there was someone who said, well, okay, this is going to have pure democratize, but it's always on balance. And I think, we'll never be in the era where opposition was just stuck in its someone, some dissident was stuck in their kitchen complaining and they could have no impact outside of their kitchen, right? So I mean, and that's and I think it's also, so in that sense, I think overall the sort of level, it's really sort of raised the bar on authoritarianism in a way that's really hard to imagine, unless I mean, outside of like a powerful state like China, outside of those, China is distinctive in its capabilities, that we could really go back, put the genie back in the bottle. And furthermore, I want to point out that even things that seem sort of, purely autocratic, like this facial recognition, right, which is like been hugely important in sort of identifying dissidents. They can just look at a crowd and they can say, okay, and then go and arrest them. Well, in Belarus, what they did, the opposition, such a wonderful opposition. I mean, they obviously failed, but they started shaming police. They were able to identify who that asshole was who was beating up a protester. So I mean, this stuff is cheap and can be used by both sides. So it's always I think it's always it can be used by both sides. Even sort of things like that would seem to be kind of most useful for autocrats.
Yeah, but let me push you both a little bit on that. I think both of you have today here, at least in the way I heard it, downplayed a little bit the sort of credible, legitimate or alternative to democracy, that it's not really there. But what I'm seeing is, and I'm also piggybacking here on a few, actually a couple of questions asked on Slido. What I see is also in many places in the world that we have this rise of elected leaders who come into power by way of relatively democratic elections and sometimes very democratic elections, but further a version of some ugly nationalism and use that to derail civil liberties and eventually democratic procedures. Whether it's sort of a Muslim nationalism in Turkey or a Hindu nationalism in India or a newborn Christian nationalism in Hungary or this alliance between Trump and evangelicals in the US and a similar thing in Brazil. I think the nationalism that Xi is trying to stir up and make stronger in China is also evident. And you see similar with Duterte in the Philippines, and that becomes an alternative, I think, to at least a pluralist view of democracy, as a legitimate foundation for at least a less democratic and often a non-democratic system. Don't you see this as a worrying trend for the future?
So, if I may,
sure.
So I mean, I think that populism is certainly a danger in the sort of the.
This is nationalist, yeah.
Both nationalism and populism, are danger. I mean, to democracy, and I think that sort of. I mean, obviously not Xi, but sort of the sort of national populist. I mean, these terms are kind of conflated, but you're right; they actually are quite different. But often they're one and the same. I mean, I think Orban is both a populist and a nationalist. That this does sort of legitimize the diminution of the reduction in civil liberties, but it's nonetheless within the context where elections are taken for granted. Right, and I mean that's why I don't see sort of that sort of devolving into sort of a real sort of closed authoritarianism. So I could be wrong, but right. But at the same time, I think this isn't necessarily. I mean, I do think I will sort of modify my claim here that there is a danger of polarization when sort of other issues such as sort of cultural threats, I guess this is where nationalism, are seen as more important than democracy. I mean, that is a real, I guess you could call it ideological. I mean, it's not a coherent ideology as a sort of a coherent replacement of democracy, but de facto sort of, polarization. I mean, if we look at all the consolidated democracies that have descended into authoritarianism, which there aren't that many. There are like 4 or 5 in the last 50, 100 years, right? Chile, Hungary, Uruguay, and the like, they've all, it's all been a function of polarization, right? And that polarization really sort of basically allows autocrats to sort of convince people to overturn democracy. So I get, yeah, that in that sense, I would agree with you.
Alex?
Yeah, I mean, of course, that's a worry. I mean, I think one of the things that to consider is, and Lucan mentioned this a couple comments ago, is the performance of these various arrangements, right? Like the nationalist populist folks, again, setting aside China, didn't perform particularly well in the pandemic, and there's a question about kind of their actual performance in delivering prosperity and security. And so the more that kind of those models don't do as well, the better that is for democracy, I'd say. China is a different case entirely, because it obviously, this nationalism came from within the party and not, it's more complicated than that, but it didn't come from the electoral politics, let's put it that way.
Yeah. But to pick up on that, and actually the most popular by democratic vote on Slido question is about COVID. And we touched upon it a little bit. I did, and you did as well. And so is there a risk here that a pandemic, a crisis like this, allow governments to shift the benchmark for legitimacy from democracy and accountability in some sort of procedural, based on a procedural basis, to pure performance in terms of saving lives and maybe eventually access to vaccine? And we see COVID now, but next time it could be bacteria that are resistant to all antibiotics we have, and then the crisis will be 10 times worse at least, right? So to what extent are these sort of crises a threat to democracy? What do you think? Yeah, Luca.
So a couple of things. One, I mean, if you look at it, Belarus, it was the opposite. I mean, Lukashenko was going along fine. His disastrous reaction to COVID was what motivated these massive protests. So it doesn't always, I think in some ways, a lot of these guys are just bad technocrats. They're bad at managing these crises. I mean, China is unique in the sense that it combines both autocracy and exceptionally good bureaucracy, and is able to actually quite effectively now deal with this pandemic. And I think in a way democracy never really was much of a presence, obviously, in China to begin with. But if anything, it's probably strengthened the party. In that sense, you're right. I think it really, it's really context specific. So in the West, I think, if your threat to democracy are these sort of cultural populists, I think it really actually helps democracy, because you don't. I mean, if you're terrified about the spread of disease, you don't want someone who some know-nothing who can't manage the crisis into power. You actually want a functioning bureaucracy. So it really is a selling point for the democratic establishment, right? I mean, like 2 years ago, it was the establishment, man. We hate the establishment. Well, that's like the establishment, man. That's pretty good.
So it's good. It's good for democracy. Right?
Well, it's good. It depends on the context. It's good if the status quo is a functioning democratic state.
Okay.
Right.
And Alex, we have about 1 minute left here, but Alex.
I agree with that. I mean, the performance in terms of COVID has been not neatly defined by regime type. Like, some democracies have performed really well, and some authoritarian states have performed relatively well. The one thing I would say is that if you read China's external propaganda, they're doing a lot to try to convince you that they've done a really good job, and that their model is best for dealing with crises. So, whether that's persuasive or not is kind of a different story. But they're trying anyway.
They're trying. Yeah. So the pandemic can be a double-edged sword, at least. And I would like to thank you both Lucan and Alex, for joining us here today on this webinar on the future of authoritarianism. It's really terrific to have you with us. It's a shame you couldn't be here in person. We'll try and make sure that happens in the future. But thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who have listened in here via Zoom or on the live on Facebook or YouTube. And we will come back in the near future with new webinars on different topics. But thanks again, everyone, and especially Alex and Lucan. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. Thanks.